Hello, wherever you are in the world today, thank you for joining us for The Rise Traveler, unpacking conversations of sustainable travel. We're here to move a step beyond the Instagram-ready world of travel and think critically and deeply about how travel can uplift global communities, protect natural ecosystems, and be a source of growth for travelers. Here at Rise Travel Institute, we are committed to empowering travelers and travel professionals through education. Our programs, research, experiential journeys, scholarships, and free resources are all aimed at bringing you closer to a more responsible and ethical travel experience. Learn more by visiting risetravelinstitute.org.
Welcome to Rise Travel Institute's podcast, The Rise Traveler, Unpacking Conversations of Sustainable Travel. I'm Vincie Ho, the guest host for Season 4. In this special season, we'll be talking to critical theory scholars, activists, and leaders in sustainability and social and environmental justices in the travel and tourism space. And together, we'll delve into the ethics of travel and discuss some of the pressing issues that are impacting communities at travel destinations around the world. And so today, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Bobbie Chew Bigby as our guest. Bobbie, thank you so much for joining our conversation today.
Thank you, Vincie.
Bobbie is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Waterloo and is an adjunct research fellow at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, the Lungu Research Institute. Bobbie is a scholar, researcher, and educator who is passionate about the potential for tourism to serve as a tool for indigenous and post-conflict communities to be connected with culture, community, and the environment. Bobbie's research and community-based work has taken her to Asia, indigenous Australia, Canada, US Indian country, and Latin America, and she has been supported by Fulbright and Rotary Peace Fellowships. Bobbie is the co-author and editor of books, including The Local Turn in Tourism, Empowering Communities, published in 2022, Socializing Tourism, Rethinking Tourism for Social and Ecological Justice, 2021, and the forthcoming Indian City, USA. Bobbie is also the lead author for the recent report. Very excited about the report that we're going to talk a little bit more later in this conversation. Climate Justice and Tourism, an Introductory Guide that has resulted from collaboration between the Travel Foundation, Tourism Cares, the Center for Responsible Travel, and others. Born and raised in Oklahoma, Bobbie is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and continues to be based primarily in Oklahoma. So I had the good fortune to connect with Bobbie through Professor Freya Higgins-Debiole, who was Bobbie's PhD advisor and co-author for like a few books. And I got to meet with Bobbie in person for the first time at the Critical Tourism Studies North America conference in Montreal 1 year ago. It was last year in August, so exactly 1 year ago. And I listened to her present her fascinating research work on indigenous-led tourism, indigenous-led toxic tours, which we're going to talk a little bit more in a bit. Before we dive into your work and your expertise, Bobbie, I'm sure that our community would be interested in getting to know you and learning more about your background, your multiple ethnicities, and the fact that you're a polyglot, fluent in a host of languages, English, Spanish, Mandarin, Chinese. I can attest to that. And also like being an avid learner of multiple languages. And probably a little bit of French from your mother too, if I'm not mistaken. And you dance and, you know, like you're so artistic. Tell us all about your personal story before we get into the serious stuff, shall we?
Thank you so much, Vincie. It's just a real pleasure to be able to be in conversation today, and thank you for inviting me.
For being here.
Yes. So, yes, today I'm addressing you from my home where I've been born and raised in Oklahoma, which is the lands technically sitting on the lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation Reservation, which is a tribe that shares a lot of cultural similarities and connections with my tribal nation, which is Cherokee Nation, which is the reservation border is just not too far from here. But yeah, growing up in Oklahoma has definitely been just a huge influence on me. I think that when people think of Oklahoma and they think of, you know, kind of the American South, American Midwest, you know, a lot of stereotypes come up. And I think a lot of people would think that it's not very diverse, that you know, I think that they have one image in their mind, but I think that I'm kind of living proof of just how diverse, you know, these areas of America are, and particularly Oklahoma. So as you mentioned, you know, I'm a very proud citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and that's through my father and through my paternal grandfather. But I am also someone of Asian American heritage, specifically Cantonese American heritage, yes, which has been one of our strongest many layers of connection
Yeah,
here.
exactly.
And then also European American. And so there are a lot of different stories as to kind of how, you know, my grandparents kind of all met and, you know, came to this area, you know, in the American Midwest, in the South. But I think it's important to know and to acknowledge, because this has also just been very important part of my work, and what part of the reason that I continue to be adamant about being based here in Oklahoma is because, you know, this is really where our communities are, particularly with our Native American tribal communities. And so, yeah, this is still home for me, and still, I think, one of the biggest sources of inspiration in my work. But I will say, you know, also having the Cantonese American and Asian American background, I think, and not having gotten to know my maternal grandpa, who is the one who is Cantonese, that has been one of kind of the strongest influences in propelling me to always want to go abroad, in propelling me to want to connect with you know, my Chinese and specifically my Cantonese roots. And so I know we'll talk about this probably in a little bit, but yes, I would say that it's these ties of family and culture and longing for connection to that has really kind of influenced all aspects of travel, but also profession and work for me. So
Yeah, and your like the yearn for connections and like getting to know different cultures, and it's something that is so rooted in your background, right? And so you just talked about how much your family history kind of propelled you to go see the world and like connect with different cultures. And you have lived and studied in many places in the world. Can you share with us some of your stories or anecdotes about your study abroad life as a student that kind of changed your life or inspired you to go on the path you're currently on?
yeah, so I'm really fortunate to have been able to be able to draw from you know, a handful of stories that I think are really all linked to experiences that have been supported by, you know, some really wonderful groups of people, some really wonderful organizations, scholarships that I really think deserve a shout out, because, you know, this is what really helps definitely, you know, kids from across the United States and hopefully other countries to be able to study abroad and start, you know, this pathway that is so life and career changing. But I guess I'll go back to one story in particular that's 21 years old. And this was my sophomore year of high school. So it was 2003. And I was really, I'll admit that I was not a happy high schooler. I was very kind of frustrated, and I think I was just very much yearning to just get started and start to go abroad and really interact, with the languages that I was wanting to learn and become proficient in. And so really what, kind of kept me propelled in high school was language study, was kind of having language study connected to these goals of potential travel and spending time abroad and all of this. And so I'd been made aware of AFS, the American Field Service, which is one of a very long-running organization here in the US that supports a lot of study abroad and intercultural learning. And I had been focusing for a number of years on Spanish and loved it. Hadn't had very many chances to travel in Latin America, but at the same time, I was really wanting to also get very serious about Chinese language study. So even though I am a quarter Cantonese, that was through my maternal grandfather. He was a Cantonese speaker and writer, but he passed away before I was born. Also, kind of in the climate in Missouri at that time where he raised my mom and our family, there was racism and there was discrimination. And so, long story short, none of my immediate family members speak Mandarin or Cantonese. And so I just really, really, really wanted to be able to connect with Chinese. So I get ready in 2003 and I apply for this AFS scholarship that's going to send me to Beijing to do language study. And then, as many of us will remember, in 2003, the world turns upside down and SARS happens.
And you were in China and when SARS happened.
No, so I was not in China when SARS happened. I was still over here in the US, but AFS said our China programs, a lot of our Asia programs, we've just had to put a temporary hold on this. So they said, you can still use this scholarship, but you need to pick a different place outside of East Asia. And I said, okay. And I looked at the list of eligible countries, and Bolivia was on there in terms of Latin America. And I thought, okay, well, I'd love to do more Spanish immersive. And I really also want to be able to connect with indigenous communities. And Bolivia is a country that has a majority indigenous population. And so I ended up being sent to Bolivia for that summer of 2003, which was really one of the most life transformative events on so many different levels. I mean, beyond just the Spanish immersion, beyond just an incredible homestay with, a family that was just so giving, but really was kind of the very first time that I had been to, I guess what we are calling now the global South. And I think seeing and experiencing real, very, very, very deep levels of social challenges, levels of just true poverty, and just being kind of immersed in a context like that, that just transformed the way that I looked at things completely, the assumptions that I brought. And why I choose to talk about Bolivia is because this has also, and I know this will connect with other parts of our conversation today, but I recently this year had the chance to return to Bolivia for the first time in 21 years, and was greeted at the airport by my host family, my host sister.
From 21 years ago? Wow.
Yes, after 21 years. Yes, and I had the chance to connect part of my work that you had mentioned of, indigenous-led toxic tours, and kind of looking at this very complicated intersection of indigenous peoples, tourism, and mining that I've been working on more recently, but really connecting that back to Bolivia. And I realized, I hadn't realized until I got back to Bolivia, that that's really where it all started. And it was during that AFS exchange that they took us, this, group of four American high school young women down into the mines in Potosi, Bolivia, which had been some of the world's largest silver mines. And, that was really where I saw a lot of just this very difficult ongoing legacies of colonialism, of extractivism, of exploitation, of human and environmental suffering. And it just changed everything about my life. So yeah, but that story for me has become all the more precious because of the connection made this year, but also because I think that it ties together these different parts of my life that initially I've been just aiming to get to China. I was just, so, but, we live in such an interconnected world that, all of these stories are woven together of SARS and of Asia and of Latin America and all of this. So yeah, that was certainly one of the most transformative experiences early on.
Wow. Well, I did not know that it had been 21 years that you returned to Bolivia last year for the first time, since you since you studied abroad at the age of what, 16?
I was 15, yeah.
You're 15, right? You almost like, I was almost in shock when you said that you were gonna go to China in 2003 when SARS happened, because I remember you told me that you were also in China when COVID started. I was like,
That's exactly right.
oh my
That's exactly right. Completely unplanned. And that was also that time in China was right ahead of the Critical Tourism Studies Asia Pacific Conference that happened in Wakayama that still went ahead. But yes, at that trip in China, as COVID unfortunately was starting to unfold and borders were starting to shut, it was also to reconnect with Chinese language, to take a proficiency exam, and also joining just a wonderful, wonderful friend and her family for Chinese New Year. But yeah, sadly, it just, yeah, took a different turn.
That's right.
Yeah.
Back to your story about Bolivia, it's just so beautiful that your host family were there at the airport to greet you after
Yeah.
years. It's just so amazing. It tells us a lot about you as well, like as someone who would stay in touch and like cherish the connections that you build and fostered. So like it's just really beautiful. So
Thank
thank you
you.
for sharing that story. And okay, so Bolivia, China, and what about Australia? I'm curious to know what motivated you to travel more than halfway across the world to study your master's and your PhD in Australia. And what gets me like more curious is that you have a background or like master's degrees in international studies, peace and conflict resolution, and another one in arts and culture administration. Why did you pick environmental justice and tourism as your research topic for your PhD research?
Yeah, so a couple of things, several things to unpack there. But I guess going back to the initial question of how I ended up going to Australia and how this kind of led for, the created the pathway for the majority of really my graduate studies that have been largely outside of the US. Even though I've tried to always connect the US and connect my own tribal context into that. So after my undergraduate studies, I graduated in 2009. I went on for a Fulbright and I was sent to Southeast Asia. I was in Cambodia for 2.5 years, also working in the tourism and arts revitalization space, which is particularly fascinating in Cambodia because of its very difficult history with the Khmer Rouge and looking at how tourism, serves as a pathway for revitalizing arts and culture. And so I was in Southeast Asia for 2.5 years. I came back home and so this was about 2012, and was really trying to kind of find my way. I was doing this was kind of the period once I got back home that I was starting to work in refugee and immigrant services. And so wanting to work with a lot of the Southeast Asian communities that are here in Oklahoma. We have very large Hmong, Burmese, Zomi communities. But also during that time, trying to figure out what are my next steps in terms of academics and professionally speaking. And so it just wasn't quite clear, had, you know, kind of, as you'd mentioned, these kind of eclectic somewhat interests, but in my heart, they, you know, I could feel how they were interwoven, even though, you know, that you don't necessarily just see a program that jumps out at you, let alone a program that, you know, has the financial resources to make it happen. But I had come across the possibility, the opportunity of a Rotary Peace Fellowship. I'd heard about it from a colleague actually in Cambodia, about this opportunity that's offered through Rotary International, which, another shout out, you know, I think that they are truly one of the most important like civic organizations in the world, that, you know, you'll go almost anywhere in the world and find a local Rotary Club. And, you know, they have a lot of pillars of their work, but one of the most important, in addition to, you know, the work that they've done in trying to eradicate polio and trying to provide clean water and sanitation, is really trying to support peace building on local and international levels. And the way that they, one of their flagship things for supporting that is the Peace Fellowship. And so they have different partner universities across the world where they send cohorts of students for a master's or a professional development certificate. But basically, Peace Fellows are selected, are eligible. You're eligible to apply no matter where you come from in the world, but you just have to have a certain number of years working in the field of some level of peace building and peace-related career. So this can be through education, this can be through refugee and immigrant work, this can be through you know, just a whole host of different things. And so I was really very fortunate to have joined my cohort of 10 people that included everyone from someone who served in the US Army to someone who is a UN peacekeeper in Haiti to someone who had, you know, a background in law and peace building in sub-Saharan Africa, to those of us who were more aligned with education, arts, culture, and creative economies. And so I was sent to the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, as part of Class 12 in 2014. Now, I did in my application, I had felt that I was drawn to Australia for a number of different reasons. I think primarily because I wanted to be able to still have somewhat of a focus in Asia, in the Asia Pacific. But I knew kind of after some of the experiences I'd had in social work and working with refugee communities that I wanted my career to kind of go back into really looking at supporting Indigenous communities and kind of connecting some of these different social injustice and environmental issues into economic issues and into tourism. But the program that I did in Australia for my master's, it was International Studies, Peace and Conflict Resolution. And so it wasn't necessarily tourism focused, but I would say that it was one of the best training grounds for really being able to take a deep dive into the deeper dynamics of, you know, what are we talking about when we talk about justice, when we talk about notions of rights and ethics, and really kind of giving that very deep and very critical context of, of engaging with justice issues, a justice lens, and then getting into colonization and decolonization, and really how we understand the world that we have inherited. That is a very complicated, challenged place. And so, yeah, so I did this program. It was a year and a half from 2014 to 2015. And throughout that time in Brisbane, I was really trying to connect with a lot of the Indigenous community organizations that were there in Australia. And I began thinking about a PhD that, you know, I wanted to kind of take that training I was having in justice issues and use that to apply that critical insight into looking at, okay, you know, how can tourism and kind of creative and cultural economies be a source of empowerment and peace building really for Indigenous communities. And so I was fortunate to have made some really, really deep and treasured connections with some different communities across Queensland, but also in Western Australia. And this is a much, much longer story. I don't know if we have total time for this in the podcast, but I was able to connect with an area of Australia in the far northwestern region called the Kimberley region, and an organization there that really focused on supporting and empowering Aboriginal communities who are really focused in strengthening their cultural activities, their land-based subsistence, you know, all of the connections to, as they say, country, living lands and waters, to culture and to community. And so one of the kind of leaders in the organization had said, well, after you're done with your master's, we'd be happy to host you if you would like to visit in this organization, see how we operate. Yeah, so, you know, if you're willing to do that, go ahead. And so I bought a one-way ticket after I finished my master's, and I went out to the Kimberley region. And it was again, alongside Bolivia and a couple of other places and communities, one of the most transformational experiences of my life. I was hosted by several different Indigenous families, by what was to become the university where I completed my PhD. And I would say, you know, in those couple of weeks, I saw the power of Indigenous-led tourism, of you know, not just inspiring me to do a PhD. It had very little to do with the PhD. It was opening my eyes on a much deeper level to just seeing how connected communities can be with the land and the water. And that, you know, in Australia, it's often talked about that among Indigenous and Aboriginal people, that their central what would be termed as like folklore or lore, those are called dreaming stories, that it's connected to this idea of the dreaming, of their creation stories, their connections to country. And, you know, really through the tours that I was able to go on, these visits out onto country and into communities, I was able to see these dreaming stories almost coming to life in the flesh. It was very powerful. So 2 weeks in, I'm getting ready to go in the 4-wheel drive with some of the organization's members out to another community, and there's just a radical life change. I learned that I was sick. I actually learned at that point that I had cancer, and because, you know, this is a regional remote area, the doctor that I saw said, you know, you need to leave as quickly as you can and start to get medical treatment. And so that, it was just very strange and surreal, the timing of all of this, of having such a powerful experience that was connected to tourism, to indigenous hosts, to being on country that was then abruptly ended with a very life-changing thing. And so I had to come home for the next 3 years. But those connections that I made with that community stayed. And so for those next 3 years of treatment, I was in touch with the community members and the folks at Notre Dame at University, and they just said, we're waiting for you. We're waiting for you to come back. And so that was where, continued to that plant that idea of the PhD in my head. But obviously it was much, much deeper than a PhD, than just thinking about an academic career. It was that this was the place that had really transformed the way I saw the world, the way I saw connections to our living environment and to communities that just give so much through being hosts. And so I was finally able to get the clear from my doctors, and in 2018, I was fortunate to have gotten a scholarship through the Australian government and went back to Australia for the first time in July of 2018 to start my PhD, looking exactly at that kind of intersection of indigenous-led tourism and if and how it can be a tool for helping to connect indigenous communities to country, lands and waters, to community and to culture. But then trying to bring that experience from my hosts in Australia into conversation with my own tribe. And so the other part of my PhD was building in kind of that case example from the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, our focus on using tourism to tell our stories. So there's a lot more to unpack, obviously, with the PhD. It was a PhD that, crossed international borders. Obviously, with the timing of it, from March 2020, it navigated COVID. And so I was only able to be in Australia for the first year and a half, really. And then so much of that PhD then kind of had to go through Zoom. And but I think, the fact that it did was tested by COVID, by Zoom, by all of this. I was just so grateful for the connections with my hosts, because that's what enabled this work to actually happen. Were those connections with elders, with rangers, with young leaders who were kind enough to have jumped on Zoom for 2 to 3 hours and doing these extended interviews, and then welcoming me back again in September of 2022, when I was finally the borders were lifted and I was able to go back and defend my dissertation. So it's been a wild ride, but that has been part of the PhD story.
Amazing. Like, this is just so fascinating listening to you share the story of, it must have been so powerful to witness how your host indigenous communities demonstrate their strong and deep connection and reverence for their lands and their waters, and being able to share that with visitors like yourself, right? And so this is just so powerful. And I know that a part, as you just mentioned, in your PhD studies, you took what you've learned and witnessed in Australia, in Aboriginal Australia, and kind of try to connect that to your home. And so tell us a little bit about your research on the indigenous-led toxic tours in Charles Creek in Oklahoma. And I still remember your presentation at the critical tourism studies conference, and one term that really is still sticking to my mind is that you used the word environmental assault. That was such a strong word, and I would love for you to elaborate a little bit on that for our listeners.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so like I said, I'm from here in Oklahoma. I've grown up primarily on the outskirts of Tulsa, which is a city that um, is kind of it's the intersection of three different tribes: my own, the Cherokee Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, where I'm technically sitting today, and the Osage Nation. But as you travel a little bit further up, actually Route 66, um, the scenic, tourism byway, to the kind of the northeastern tip of our Cherokee Nation reservation. In that far northeastern tip of Oklahoma, you will actually find 8 other different tribal nations from originally from all across the United States and Canada that had been forcibly brought here, because also my tribe, we were forcibly removed here. This was against our will, and we were forcibly removed by the government in the 1800s. And up in that area of far northeastern Oklahoma, you have multiple different tribes that have called now that part of Oklahoma their adopted homelands. And you have an area that's called Tar Creek. So a creek that runs and connects with many of the different waterways and systems up there. And growing up, I had heard the name Tar Creek. I'd heard a little bit about it, but I'll be very honest, and I had been ashamed of this, but I'm working through that, like that I had been ashamed for a long time that I hadn't been more aware of why people were talking about Tar Creek, why there was just a lot of media and a lot of really challenging stories connected to this. It really wasn't until I actually came back home for my medical treatment and, went through that process over years that I started reading a lot more and, connecting to a lot of the people and elders who are very connected to the Tar Creek site. And so basically, in a nutshell, what happened with Tar Creek is that in that area of far northeastern Oklahoma, it had been one of the richest sources of lead and zinc mining in the entire world from the late 1800s, really up until the 1960s. The lead and zinc that had been mined from that area, which was and is primarily on tribal land that had been really taken again against tribal wishes. Most of those minerals were what was crucial for winning World War I and World War II, because that lead and zinc was what basically formed the bullets, most of the bullets that were used in the world wars. And so for a while it was an economic powerhouse, but after the wars ended and the lead and zinc mining became less profitable, the mines closed down and basically the area was not rehabilitated. The mines closed shop, the communities began to go in decline, economic decline, because they didn't have those mines anymore. And then by the 1960s and this 1970s, community members start to become much more aware of really the environmental and the health impacts of what has happened. And so from all of the extensive mining and the lack of remediation, basically the mine cavities filled up with water because they had mined into aquifers, essentially. So they fill with water that's now become contaminated with heavy metals. And this water is now spilling out and draining into Tar Creek, which flows into the rivers, and then into Grand Lake, which is one of Oklahoma's biggest other natural tourism attractions. And so it stains, this heavy metal contamination stains Tar Creek, this really eerie rust red color that you see. But it doesn't stop there. You have heavy metal contamination in the topsoil. As you drive through this area of Tar Creek and the surrounding communities of Pitcher and Carden, Commerce, Quapaw, you see what look like large hills or small mountains. But when you get up closer, you see that they're actually piles of what they call chat. And chat are the remains of the mining processing of rock. So it's the smaller, finer, kind of almost like grains of sand, in some cases, large stones, but very, very high in toxic heavy metal contamination. And unfortunately, for a lot of the community members that had lived there, children had been exposed for years and years playing on those chat piles, absorbing through their skin these heavy metals and toxins. So they'd been absorbing that through the topsoil, in the water, but then also even in the air. Studies have shown that there is contamination in the air of, a lot of this very fine dust. And so unfortunately, by the 1990s, then, as they had doctors come and public health officials come and test, the children had some of the highest blood lead levels in the country. And those impacts of lead contamination and lead poisoning, lead not only to very high rates of cancer, kidney, liver disease, but also really significant neurological impacts, ADHD, learning difficulties. And so it just really is something that is beyond impacting quality of life, but actually even impacts survivability. So I had begun to connect with some of the community members who, have been lifelong residents or who have worked with the communities, with the schools and the school children in this area. And I had really begun to have some deeper conversations with Rebecca Jim, who is a fellow Cherokee Nation citizen, and who I see as an elder and mentor. And also with her partner, Earl Hatley, who is also from Oklahoma, has connections to many of our tribes. And basically in the early 90s, Earl and Rebecca together had founded an organization called LEAD. And this stands for Local Environmental Action Demanded. And they have really been at the forefront where, the mining companies have kind of gotten up and left. Even, our federal, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has not delivered on a rehabilitation level, on a financing level, for being able to support this really horrific environmental assault that's turned also into a social assault, a cultural assault on people, the people who've been living there over generations.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been lead agency that's been at the forefront of this. And one of their primary tools for really getting people to care and trying to not only get people to care and make people aware, but try to keep that going, of continuing to keep people caring, has been through leading toxic tours. So taking people, whether it's been on bicycle, on foot, in school buses, right into kind of the epicenter of seeing Tar Creek, seeing where the water comes out, and this heavy metal contamination happens and then spreads down to Tar Creek, into the river, draining then from the Neosho River and Spring Rivers into Grand Lake. And seeing just all of the multi-layered impacts of this, that, we're not just talking about rehabilitation of waterways or of trying to, clear away contaminated topsoil and put on, uncontaminated soil, as they do in other areas where there have been nuclear things like in Fukushima. This is about really trying to make people aware that this has impacted the bodies and health of community members, many of whom are tribal members who, have histories already of being forcibly relocated to these lands in Oklahoma, and now again having to be forcibly in a sense, relocated because this land has become so toxic because of extractive industry. And then kind of pointing to the connections that for a lot of tribal communities who depend on fishing or crawdad gigging or, you know, harvesting of wild onions or wild strawberries, of watercress, that when the biologists now test, you know, a lot of these plants and animals and fish, that they're contaminated now. So, you know, you start to kind of get into this deeper web that I think for our tribal communities is just so it's just so fundamental. There's just a fundamental understanding that this is how the world works. But I think that science is now catching up to this, of seeing that, oh gosh, this is all interconnected. And what we have done to the land, you know, this is not a quick fix. But so bringing this back to the toxic tours, you know, I've just been really inspired by Rebecca and Earl, and in them choosing to use this tool to be able to bring and sustain awareness. And so together we've collaborated on a number of writing projects, journal articles, book chapters, but also seminars and presentations to communities locally and internationally, talking about the power of these toxic tours and the stories that they tell.
This is so powerful, and it's education is so important. Like, people need to be aware of, as you said, like all these deep web, like how things are interconnected. It's not just, you know, clearing the site that would help address the issue, because we're talking about long-term health, you know, issues that the residents are experiencing. And you talked about this kind of environmental justice or injustice caused by the extractive industry. And I want to shift a little bit about like towards another kind of extractive industry, which is supposed to remediate the climate change or the climate crisis. And so now we're looking at how the world, or how international, how like the international communities, governments, and corporations are now looking at transitioning to clean energy and like build solar farms, increase the production of like electric vehicles and so on, that like many of us believe are the solution, right? And according to a report by the International Energy Agency, the IEA, demand for critical minerals experienced strong growth in 2023, with lithium demand rising by 30%, while demand for nickel, cobalt, graphite, and rare earth elements also increases, ranging from 8% to 15%. Clean energy applications have become the main driver of demand growth for a range of critical minerals. So I'm just quoting from the report. And what is shocking to me is not just the growth percentage of minerals needed for the transition, but the framing of these facts, like words like strong growth, demand growth, from a purely economic perspective, as if it was something positive. And to look at this, look at this purely from the growth mindset, like with a growth mindset, of course it is positive, because, more growth means more money because of those emerging markets. But we're not talking about the lives and all the human rights violations and environmental toll that mining these minerals would result. So your reports or your projects are extremely important in revealing these facts. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about Bolivia and Chile, the recent projects that you've been working on, and the stories of the people whose lives are severely affected by by the mining. And people are not aware, consumers are not aware when they buy a new phone or when they buy a new Tesla, and people would think that they've found a solution to climate change. We talk about decarbonization. And once they've switched to clean energy, or offset their carbon, they're good. They don't need to change their lifestyle, or that they can continue to live the way they do. And this is exactly why we need to educate people about the connections, like, as you said, the interconnectedness between climate change, climate justice, and our behaviors, our consumer behaviors, and the need for not only climate solutions, but just climate solutions. I hope that I'm articulating that clearly. And so I would love for you to share with our listeners, maybe in 5 minutes, your recent projects in Chile and Bolivia, and what is the link between decarbonization, mining, climate, and tourism?
Right. Yes. So, I think a lot of this really connects back to, some of the stories that we've been visiting of Tar Creek and that initial experiences just as a high schooler in Bolivia, going on a mine tour. And it really kind of digging deep and, thinking about this present moment that we're in, where it's very clear that the climate crisis is something that is just omnipresent, right? I mean, it's everywhere that you turn. It isn't just that, we've hit the peak global temperature this summer, or, we're seeing it in every season. People are seeing it in their everyday life. And, I think that for a long time, why I've kind of not felt like I almost belonged in environmental conversations or climate conversations is because oftentimes, and I think the kind of prevailing mainstream discourse on climate issues has been one that has been very Western science based and solely, and also primarily based in talking about the idea of carbon emissions, carbon measuring, which I want to emphasize is so important, that it's hugely important. It's important to inform, what the UN bodies are doing, what governments and what industries can do. But I think that if we kind of get into this narrow tunnel vision of carbon, we're really starting to miss the point. And I think that when I began kind of stepping back a bit and going like, why do I feel like I don't fit into these conversations, or I don't have anything relevant to say? And then started really kind of drawing on my experiences and what I witnessed with Tar Creek, what I witnessed in Bolivia with the mining there, and seeing that these legacies of mining, they're not of the past, they're of the present. Like it's very much, it's just taking a very different form, and there's kind of a different spin on it, but it's actually in many cases impacting a lot of the same places. I started to feel like, what, my perspective on this, that I think is guided much more by an indigenous perspectives and philosophies that really show you can't just be looking at carbon. You have to look, mining is mining. And as I've heard many indigenous elders say, we cannot mine our way out of the climate crisis that humans ourselves have created. I just think that there's just such value to that, really embracing that perspective and all of the complexities, the horror, but I think all of the hope that that also can potentially bring, because I think it gets us out of this, what you had said of using these same words over and over of carbonization, decarbonization, growth, all of this. It gets us out of this hamster wheel and starting to look at the broader possibilities. So connecting this to kind of Chile and Bolivia, so I started the first year of my postdoc with University of Waterloo in Canada last year, and I was really grateful that my incredible supervisor and mentor, Dr. Brian Grimwood, we had first really connected about this indigenous-led toxic tour work, and he just said, I'd really like to continue to support you doing this and you doing it from your community. And as I kind of got deeper into some of the collaborations I was doing with Rebecca and Earl, writing on that, I was just starting to kind of expand how I was looking at mining in the context of climate crises and this emerging concept of climate justice. And it was also taking me back through my reading and my studies back to Bolivia. I kept thinking back to that mine tour that I'd taken. And then as I was reading more about, well, what is the mining that is required for what we are using every day, in cell phones, in, electric vehicles, in solar power, in the grid. It's these key minerals, metals that you mentioned: lithium, copper, cobalt, lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, nickel, but then also, graphite, aluminum, some of these other things. And, immediately I began going to, where they've been talking about the lithium. And one of the main places, one of the largest sources of lithium in the world is what's called the Lithium Triangle. And this is an area of basically kind of the highland Andes that's shared between the borders of Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina. Where you have just some of the driest desert landscapes in the world, the Atacama Desert. You have some of the largest salt flats, and it's really kind of beneath the ground in these very, very arid, but mineral rich areas where you end up finding not only copper, which copper has been, exploited in Chile for a very long time, but you also find the lithium. And you'll see in a lot of the reporting that's been done already on this topic that, this doesn't necessarily look like the mining that we're used to, that's oftentimes below ground or, into blowing up sides of mountains. This is mining that's done through extracting brine underground and pumping that mineral-rich brine into these large pools that then over time, over months, about 1.5 years, evaporate. And so you see these kind of drone or aerial shots oftentimes of these pools that are just technicolored, turquoise, chartreuse, pink, as that brine is going through stages of evaporation. And so I began to just get really interested in understanding more about this and in really kind of chipping away at, moving beyond just talking about decarbonization as, the automatic solution for the climate crisis. And thus everybody's just got to get on board with this green tech wave, really trying to see what are the sources of these minerals and who's being impacted. And so this kind of coincided with the Climate Justice Project, the Climate Justice in Tourism Project that I had worked on together with the Travel Foundation and others. But basically, thanks to one of the partners in that research collaboration, Marco Lucero of Cuidadores de Destinos, who is Chile-based and doing really phenomenal work on, really stewardship of places in tourism. I was invited by his organization and team to Chile in April of this year to be able to talk at his event called Reimagina Turismo, Reimagining Tourism. To talk about some of these preliminary themes, talk about, some of the work I've been doing with toxic tours and the climate justice paper. But one of the most beautiful and kind of unexpected twists in the journey was that as part of kind of the international delegation that he brought in, of myself and a couple of other speakers from outside of Chile, we were invited by the Chilean Ministry of Tourism and some of the local tourism bodies to be able to go up to that part of northern Chile, the Atacama Desert, where this lithium and copper extraction is happening. And so we were able to tour some of these communities that are being impacted by this extraction, who are very concerned about the impacts that they are already seeing to, the driest desert landscape, their homeland in the world. And while, yes, you may not have the same impacts that you see with traditional hard rock mining or underground mining, or, things may not be measured in terms of carbon emissions, they're seeing huge impacts to their water sources. And, all of this extraction, processing, and exploitation is using massive amounts of fresh water in, again, the driest desert landscape in the world. I was also really fortunate to have crossed the border into Bolivia. And one of the things that I've also prioritized during my postdoc research assignment has been writing not just for academia and for industry, but really prioritizing writing for communities. And one of the outlets I've done that through is Cultural Survival Magazine, which is an indigenous-led organization and magazine that's really focused on this impact of transition metal mining and the impacts on indigenous communities. And so with the support of Cultural Survival, I was able to be hosted by two of the organizations they support there in Bolivia, who are both standing in opposition to transition metal mining and extraction. So the first organization is one that is led by an Aymara man named Carlos Mamani, who's trying to revitalize their traditional practices of salt harvesting, but also making people aware of the nearby copper mining and the environmental impacts and hazards of that, as well as the potential for the lithium extraction. The other host that I was able to visit was down on the Uyuni salt flat, which is the largest salt expanse in the world. Efrain Quispe Juarez was my host there, and his community and the traditional Aymara leadership of Marcatahua are trying to take a stand, supported by Cultural Survival Organization, of saying we do not want lithium extraction. We want investment and support in community-led and cultural tourism. We see that as the viable economic alternative that is more in our control. And so I was just really honored to be hosted by all of these communities across Chile and Bolivia, and that some of these stories are coming out kind of as we speak through Cultural Survival that, like I said, are accessible to everybody.
That's fascinating what you just said. And it's so important for people to understand that when we talk about climate change, it's not just about, well, okay, you talked about the kind of environmental assault that happened in the past and is still happening today to indigenous communities around the world. When people think about climate change, they also don't think about the present. They think about the future, like pictures of the polar bear extinct, going on extinct, or, thinking for our future generations. However, like people are currently dying and like being severely impacted by climate change. And we already, like communities around the world, especially vulnerable communities, are already, or have already been impacted or like really like suffering because of the impacts. So So making sure that people understand that it is not something in the past and it's not something in the future. It is what is happening, and we need to address that now. And
That's right.
yeah, and it's so powerful that you are looking to these projects and looking into, how this, as you said, the transition mining is so harmful to communities around the world, even though the rest of the world, they like believes that that is the solution to climate change. It's to me, it's almost like a new kind of colonialism, like we consume in the developed world and we are like impacting the climate in all sorts of different ways because of our lifestyle and our habits of consumption, not knowing that like, oh, transitioning to clean energy actually comes with a cost. So with this, I would like for you to like, looking at the clock, I think we should kind of wrap up our conversation very soon. But before we do that, I would love for you to talk a little bit about the notion of decolonizing tourism or decolonizing travel, or just like decolonizing what you are working on, like, you know, especially looking at this extractive industry and what decolonizing would mean, like the process of decolonization, what would that look like? And then I would then like ask you to give us a very quick definition of climate justice, because that's essentially what we have been talking about. So let's talk about decolonization first. What does decolonizing travel mean to you? If you have to explain that to a traveler.
Yeah. So for me, I think the decolonizing, meaningful decolonized travel is really trying your best as a traveler to just make space for integrating as many of these different perspectives and lenses as possible. Really kind of becoming a really deep and good listener, and not kind of being the first one to you know, come in with assumptions about what you want, what you expect out of that place, but you know, for it to kind of start on you know, the other end, that you come in as just a very willing and deep listener to, you know, hearing about all of the different ways that people and beings relate to the world around you. And, you know, doing your best. I think it is a big ask when people say, like, you know, try to fit into someone else's shoes. You know, I think that can be a big ask. But I think that by asking travelers to just really do your best to just become more active and deeper listeners, I think is a really good starting place with decolonizing, because I think that, you know, what has to be addressed with decolonizing tourism, or really decolonizing anything, is that it's not easy. Like, it's not easy, and it leads to a lot of very challenged and oftentimes uncomfortable, awkward conversations, realizations, experiences, as we kind of grapple with just the realities of a lot of the systems that our modern world, you know, is in, and how we got here, you know, whether we're talking about the level of geopolitical power imbalances, communities that have been historically marginalized or discriminated against, you know, our non-human relatives of the plants and animals, and how, you know, they've really been just exploited and just used, and you know, how it's just been a very human-centered, and not only human-centered world, but human economic growth-centered world that has really just caused a lot of harm to most people and most places. But I'd also just, I kind of go back to what I've heard a lot of, you know, folks in my own community and Indigenous elders say, of that oftentimes when, you know, they're asked to talk about decolonization, they often say, you know, well, we don't really have a word in our traditional languages for decolonizing. So decolonizing, and I think that the point that they make with that is that decolonizing, it's a starting place, and it's a really important one. I think really to kind of unpack what we've been talking about earlier, of this broader context of critically understanding justice and how it manifests. But I think that for a lot of Indigenous communities, decolonizing is just the starting place. And that because we don't have a word for that in our language, what a lot of Indigenous and tribal communities would say is that we want not only decolonized travel, but travel that is centering our central values, our central concepts that we have words for.
Mm.
And so, you know, when I kind of think about like some of the writing I did in my dissertation, talking about like my own tribe's, you know, tourism experience and the cultural values that we center it around, you know, we center it around the power of storytelling, gagoga, like, and just that in itself is, it's a guiding, it's not just a practice or an action, but it's a guiding value that really connects, you know, what you were talking about of the deep past with the future and this present moment. And so I think that when we kind of move, use decolonizing and decolonization as a starting point, but then for a lot of indigenous and traditional communities, we jump deep into centering our traditional values that are in our languages. You start to kind of see very meaningful manifestations of what decolonized travel and tourism experiences can and should look like.
I love that you I love that you used the word, or like you, well, it's not your word, but like your elders' word, about centering the traditional values and centering, and by saying centering, we actually want travelers to decenter themselves,
Exactly.
remove themselves from the center, and as you said earlier, practice active and deep listening, and not go into a place with assumptions of the places and the people. And
Yeah.
that is, yeah, I really appreciate this way to unpack the notion of the decolonial approach to travel. And just to wrap up today's conversation, I think we can talk for hours, as you know, as usual. That's what we do, the two of us. But I think we really need to wrap up the conversation. Before we do that, I would love for you to help unpack the term climate justice for the listeners and the RISE community. Talk a little bit about, like very briefly, about what climate justice means, and why has the entire world not talking about this yet? And like, what are some of the reasons why the international community, like, you know, corporations and governments, are not really addressing climate justice, but like really focusing on what you earlier said, like carbon accounting, and thinking about electrification, decarbonization, and carbon offsetting, carbon credit investments, and all these things as the solutions, or as the only solutions. Can you just very briefly explain the concept, please?
So I would say that climate justice is this concept that is trying to kind of take the conversation that's been centered in looking at climate change, climate crisis, and climate action that has, you know, kind of traditionally been centered in carbon accounting, carbon mitigation, decarbonization efforts. And it really tries to kind of shift it more towards applying the systems thinking, but really centering the communities that are, you know, as we say in the report that we've just released, that climate justice is an inclusive approach that really tries to put at the center the communities that are, number one, most impacted by climate change impacts, disasters, crises, and yet with the recognition that it is oftentimes those communities that face the worst impacts that both historically and into the present have had the least contribution overall to the carbon emissions due to legacies of, you know, historical legacies of largely colonization and just the geopolitical kind of power imbalance that we've seen really from, you know, the 19th century onwards. And so I think that climate justice is this really exciting and more inclusive lens that does start to, you know, in a meaningful way, shift that conversation away from just the mainstream solutions of decarbonization. That I don't want to say that those solutions are, you know, easy, because they're not either. But I think that they are kind of, those mainstream solutions are very tunnel visioned. They're very tunnel visioned in an understanding of the world that, you know, our activities, our economic activities, are, you know, causing carbon emissions, and we need to find scientific solutions to mitigating and adapting to the carbon that we've put. And so you're fundamentally questioning the mode of what we're doing. You're not questioning what are we doing. And so I think that climate justice takes it back to the very beginning of questioning, not just, oh, you know, we need to be using more green technology and electric vehicles, electric aviation, that you know, that changes the mode. Climate justice is saying we need to go back to the very beginning of what are we actually even doing. And I think that climate justice's power is not only in applying you know, really critical understandings of justice towards, you know, human impacts, environmental impacts, the more than human, to animals, plants, living ecosystems, but really some critical justice perspectives to economic systems, because I think that this is where we get into thorny and often difficult conversations, particularly in talking with government, you know, multilateral and multinational institutions, industries, is that, you know, our fundamental social economic systems are built on a framework that prioritizes and basically lives off of increased growth in, you know, on a Mother Earth that has, as they say, finite resources, and, you know, is not able to follow that. And so until we really kind of get to that key kernel of where the problems are, that it is, you know, this just massive human consumption of resources that we view as resources. You know, we even just use this word resources rather than just saying water or our food sources or all of this. You know, we view it in these economic terms. I think that climate justice helps us really to kind of start to get to the kernel of what the problems are, is that we're not needing to just change the modes and look at decarbonizing or gases or things like that. We're needing to go back to really what are kind of the sources of these problems. But again, like with decolonizing, these are not easy conversations. They're very difficult to have. They're very contentious because this is really kind of the central framework of how our political and economic systems work. And to question them is radical, but it shouldn't be. So
to question them is radical because we are asking to dismantle a mindset and a framework that is dependent on, or that is, you know, that believes in economic growth, or like, you know, infinite economic growth. And
right.
And so to really address that, as you said, like we need to really challenge the fundamental like framework, like the way we think, the way we understand the world, the way the world operates currently, looking at lives and animals and plants and lands and waters as resources for human consumption again, right? And so if we can really like challenge that and dismantle that mindset, that is when we can really start to address the climate change crisis, isn't it? And so, yeah, well, thank you so much, Bobbie, for this really meaningful conversation. Before we wrap up, I know that I said like that multiple times already, but we always ask this final question to all of our guests on our podcast. Bobbie, what legacy do you want to leave behind? I know it's a tough question, right?
It is.
I'll give you a minute to think about that.
Yeah, so I guess the legacy that I would hope to leave behind um, is kind of parallel to the legacy of like the experiences that I had, on many of these indigenous-led tours and visits out onto country, whether that was, in the Kimberley region in Australia, whether it's been, on a toxic tour here in just within my own tribal communities, whether it's been going deep into the Cerro Rico mine, in Bolivia, that I would just wish to be able to inspire in people to be able to go out there, to make the connections, to be open, to, what you learn and what surprises you, and be humble when, you do see that your assumptions are challenged, or that you see you may have even been wrong or kind of missing the mark a bit. And yeah, that those experiences alongside traditional owners and local hosts, that they would inspire in so many more visitors and travelers this very, very deep connection to seeing the world as it truly is, as not as this source of endless economic growth and resources, and a place that we can just assault, for our own human economic needs, but as, really the source of, all life on Earth, and being able to connect deeply and relish those connections with other communities, with animals, with plants, with the living environments. That's, I could only hope that, some of the things that I've shared, but really helping to kind of put the spotlight on some of my other collaborators and partners, that this is a legacy that we could inspire in others, is to go out there and be open to having these kind of deeper connections to the world that transform you and the way that you exist in that world.
Bobbie, let me tell you that this is not a hope. You're already doing it. And I'm sure that like listeners, like if they have the privilege to listen to this conversation with you, they would be motivated when they visit Bolivia one day. They won't be just taking selfies on the Uyuni salt flats, but like really understanding what's happening underneath, and also like, seeking to connect with the, wonderful indigenous communities there as well, like you always do. So thank you so much for being an inspiration.
Thank
That
you.
really brings us to the end of our journey today. Thank you so much, Bobbie, for such a powerful conversation. I'm deeply moved by your work, and please keep it up. I look forward to continuing working closely with you. And for our listeners, Bobbie and I, we are currently developing a carbon literacy and climate justice training for hospitality and tourism professionals to be launched this fall. And we're privileged to have Tourism Cares and the Center for Responsible Travel to be our partners on this project. So please, please, please stay tuned for more information. If you like what you heard and would like to hear more, please subscribe, like, and comment. You can follow us at Rise Travel Institute on Facebook and Instagram. Here at Rise Travel Institute, we believe that travel could be a powerful tool for positive and transformative change. If you're a college student planning on a study abroad trip, or a professional thinking about that gap year or a sabbatical, or anyone who's currently traveling the world and wants to understand how to travel in a responsible, or sustainable, impactful, and ethical way, we do encourage you to head to risetravelinstitute.org for more information on our educational resources. We'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, keep roaming, keep learning, keep listening, and continue to be a Rise Travel.
That brings us to the end of our journey today. If you liked what you heard and would like to hear more, please subscribe, like, and comment. You can follow us at Rise Travel Institute on Facebook and Instagram. Here at Rise Travel Institute, we believe conscious travel can help us create a more just and equitable world. If you are a college student planning a study abroad trip, a tourism professional who wants to create a more equitable and inclusive industry, or anyone who is currently traveling the world and wants to understand how to travel in a just and sustainable way, we do encourage you to head to risetravelinstitute.org for more information on our educational programs. We will be back soon with another episode, and until then, keep roaming, keep learning, and continue to be a Rise Traveler.